Good. So welcome everyone. My name is Professor Carolyn Dudek. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department here at Hofstra University, and I'd like to welcome you all to another installment of Political Science Talks Politics. This speaker series started about a year and a half ago as we were getting ready for the 2020 election, which now seems like it was a long time ago, doesn't it? In sort of preparing students and our wider community for the election, we thought we would tap into the expertise of our faculty to talk about different aspects moving into the election cycle. And as we continued the series, we realized that our faculty have a lot to add to talk about all kinds of issues that are facing not only our community in the United States, but around the world. And so today I'm delighted to add sort of an international flair, if you will, to our speaker series with our speaker today, Professor Stefanie Nanes. And many of you probably know that Professor Nanes is an expert on politics in the Middle East. She has written extensively on issues of citizenship and gender in Jordanian politics. And, she's really become quite an expert in that particular field. She also teaches courses in our department, not just on Middle Eastern politics, but even within her specialization of women and development in the Middle East. And as many of you know, we've just marked the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring. And so Professor Nanes is here to enlighten us as to what does it look like now that we're 10 years out. How can we understand where are we in the Middle East today? And so I'm absolutely delighted to have Professor Nanes speak to us today. And her talk is entitled Arab Spring, 10 years later. So I'm just going to give the floor to Professor Nanes. What I'm going to do is ask everyone to stay on mute. And when the talk ends, we'll leave time for question and answer. Okay, Thank you.
Great. All right, thank you, Professor Dudek. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to be here with all of you. So our story, many of you have probably heard this. Our story starts in December of 2010, when a Tunisian fruit vendor set himself on fire in protest against being humiliated by a police officer. His act of defiance set into motion a cascade of massive protests throughout the Arab world against regimes that were corrupt, repressive, and had presided over decades of economic stagnation. And what started in Tunisia spread quickly and in very significant ways to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. All 6 of these countries experienced large-scale, sustained protests in which thousands of protesters called openly for the downfall of the regime and its replacement with a democratic form of government. And now I'm going to attempt to maneuver over so you can see my background. This is Tahrir Square in Cairo, which was the site of them. I have a very short clip because I think the images of the protests are a good starting point just to get a sense of what they looked like. So I'm going to maneuver over. I'm going to start this quickly. We'll watch about a minute of this. It's from a film called Goodbye Mubarak. It was actually filmed in late 2010 before they even knew this was going to happen.
On January 25th, 2011, the Egyptian people rose up. Hundreds of thousands of demonstrators flocked into Tahrir Square in central Cairo with one unified call, Mubarak out. For 18 days until the president stepped down, pictures of the uprising were beamed around the world. Egypt became a symbol of the Arab Spring. To many, this revolution had seemed improbable, and yet, 3 months earlier, we were in Cairo on the same Freedom Square, then empty. Egypt was already in turmoil, and we wanted to find out what was going on in this country once at the forefront of Arab.
All right, that's when you try things new. And that worked, right? You saw that. Okay, great. Sorry, my first time doing one of these. So that gives you an idea of the sheer scale of the protests. That was in Egypt. That was in Tahrir Square, which you see behind me. Now, I can't, so again, I made a list of 6 regimes that faced similar sizes of protest. I can't go into much detail, and it's important for us to understand what these regimes look like in order to understand why there was so much anger against them. And we don't have time to go into extensive detail on each regime, but suffice it to say that all 6 of them were authoritarian with at least several of the following features. You had single party rule, the use of rigged elections and voter suppression to ensure that single party dominance, as well as the exclusion of all other political parties. You had widespread security states and surveillance. You had the widespread use of arrest, violence, and in some cases torture against political opponents. And you had extraordinary levels of corruption. All right. Some of these countries held elections, but often with only one candidate for president. And in 4 of these countries, Egypt, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, the military played a significant role in sustaining these authoritarian dictatorships. All right, so you have some similarities across these regimes, and you also have some similarities across the demands of the Arab Spring protesters. Simply put, they demanded for the fall of the regime. You saw that in the subtitles or the translation over there. They demanded the overthrow of the existing regime and its replacement by parliamentary constitutional democracy. That was the most basic demand. And there were also demands for an end to the corruption and a more just economic system with a more fair and equitable distribution of wealth and opportunity. All right, so now I will hopefully more successfully. So here's a summary of our 6 countries and the countries we're going to take a look at, and sort of I've given you the name of the leader because we may refer back to this person, type of regime, as well as their outcome. Okay, and as we can see, there was a wide range of outcomes across these 6 countries that saw these relatively similar enough authoritarian regimes, as well as relatively similar massive protests. And in terms of outcome, Bahrain's protests were crushed early on by Saudi intervention. Look at Saudi military intervention. Syria fell into civil war, a long and bloody civil war, but the regime won. The regime re-emerged intact. Of the 4 remaining countries, and I've just like the 4 who advanced to the next round, they successfully overthrew their dictators, they overthrew their governments, but 2 of them, Libya and Yemen, both fell into civil war within a couple of years, as well as having their territory divided. I mean, the countries sort of split apart, and we'll see that similarity. And finally, Egypt and Tunisia, who both successfully overthrew their dictators and did not fall into civil war. Only one, I mean, Egypt has seen the return of military rule with a military coup in 2013, and only Tunisia, out of the original 6, made a successful transition to democracy. All right. However, even in Tunisia, where they have made a successful transition to democracy, Tunisian expectations about democracy have been disappointed. Tunisia continues to experience very high rates of unemployment, a stagnant economy, and within the recent weeks, there have been days of protests about precisely this situation. Okay, so what I'd like to take as my main question in this talk is what accounts for this wide divergence of outcomes when we have comparable causes and comparable demands. All right, so I'm going to, and I've listed these in the order in which I'm going to talk about them. And we'll start with, so why did some regimes remain in power? right? Because both Bahrain and Syria, those regimes both remained in power. So starting, sort of successfully didn't, I'm gonna, I'll give you one more image. And then I don't have too many more images of the protesters. So here's Bahrain. Here's Bahrain at the height of their protests. This is called the Pearl Monument or the Pearl Roundabout. First, in February 14th, mass protests broke out in Bahrain. This was mostly caused by a Shia majority against their Sunni minority monarchy. All right, these protests continued to escalate. There was a violent response by Bahraini security forces. About a month after these protests in Bahrain starts, Saudi Arabia, which borders Bahrain, so Saudi Arabia is right next to Bahrain and has its own restive Shia population, sensed a threat to a fellow Sunni monarchy and sent 4,000 Saudi troops as well as tanks into the streets of Bahrain to put down the protests. March 18th, this Pearl Monument that you see right here was destroyed. Since it had been a locus of protests, it was destroyed. And by March 30th, Arab Spring was over in Bahrain. I put Bahrain first, it's sort of the easiest. They had massive protests. There was in fact a threat to the Sunni monarchy, or it definitely felt a threat that it could be overthrown. And it called on for military reinforcements from neighboring Saudi Arabia. And within about a month and a half, it was over. In terms of drawing conclusions from Bahrain, it's kind of hard, but basically there might be a special category if you are a protester in a Sunni monarchy right next to the most powerful Sunni monarchy in the region. You're just kind of out of luck from the very start. But let's see that. So there we have Bahrain. I want to get back to my PowerPoint. So Syria is actually much more complicated. Protests in Syria began on March 15th. 2 weeks into these protests, that President Assad launched a brutal crackdown. So even though these protests had started and they had been peaceful, there was a very brutal crackdown, military units firing into the crowd. And once peaceful protesters very quickly became armed rebels. And these are armed rebels that were backed by Saudi Arabia, as well as money from other Gulf countries. So you have wealthy donors from the Gulf, from the Arabian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on, sending money to the rebels. Turkey, very early on, Turkey also threw its weight behind the rebels against, or those opposing and calling for the downfall of the Syrian regime. In response, the Syrian regime resorted to chlorine barrel bombs. These are barrel bombs that drop with chemical weapons that then explode and kill a lot of people. Chlorine barrel bombs, the destruction of vital resources, vital infrastructure, like water mains, electricity, widespread massacre, as well as forced starvation. There were cities that were literally encircled and goods were not allowed in. So an extraordinarily violent response by the regime. However, the rebel, again, I'm using the term rebel, right? Opponents, those fighting for the overthrow of the regime, those rebel factions, they grew larger, they multiplied, again, due to their backing from wealthy donors in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And in fact, early on, those rebel forces were able to capture significant territory from the Syrian regime in the early years. Okay, so so much so that by July of 2012, yeah, sorry, I should have a timeline for you, but July 2012, about a year after everything starts, the regime actually seems like it's not on the verge of collapse, or that it's kind of not clear if they're going to be able to hold on to power. Now, the point I want to make here is that even as the regime is basically fighting for its life, the military remained cohesive, meaning it didn't splinter into pieces. It remained cohesive and it remained loyal to the Assad regime. So again, if we're trying to answer the question, why did some regimes remain in power? again, we're leaving aside Bahrain, which was foreign intervention that crushed it. Within Syria, the first part, and we'll look at foreign intervention, but the first part is you want to look at what did the military do, right? And in the Syrian case, the military remained cohesive. It didn't splinter apart, you know, looking ahead to Libya and Yemen, which is what's going to happen, but the military remains cohesive and it remains loyal, okay? So just file that away because those two factors are going to be different in helping to explain cases where the dictator or the authoritarian leadership was overthrown, right? You had a handful, you did have some military defections. You had some high-ranking generals from the Syrian military that defected, i.e. went over to the rebels. But for the most part, right, for the most part, the military sort of held together and remained loyal to the regime. So picking up where we left off, July 2012, a year later, you know, the regime, Syrian government has lost territory, is sort of fighting for its life. And by the following year, within the following year, you have a number of reinforcements arriving for the regime in the form of Shia militias or militias from neighboring Shia countries. You've got Iran's Revolutionary Guard shows up to help out the Assad regime. You've got Lebanon's Hezbollah showing up to help the Syrian regime, as well as other Shia militias from Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, and here in my very descriptive PowerPoint, right, the second point is like, if you're gonna try to remain in power, you wanna get foreign involvement on your behalf. All right, so here you have the beginning of external involvement on behalf of the Syrian regime. At this point, it's just Shia militias. And at this point, sort of 2013, 2014, it's been fought the Syrian civil war has been fought to a standstill of sorts. You have multiple actors or multiple fighting forces within it. You've got the Syrian regime, you've got Syrian rebels. And by the way, Syrian rebels they were dozens of them, a lot of them inspired by Islamism, some of them secular, a lot of them backed by different donors. You had literally dozens of militias, separate militias fighting against the regime. And there was a standoff. Like there was sort of more or less a standoff. There were these various forces, they had enough firepower, literally firepower and weapons to take some territory, to hold on to some territory, and certainly to inflict significant damage on the civilian population. But there was no force that had enough power to overcome all of the others. Okay, so they just didn't have enough power. And the decisive turn in the war, that came when you had Russian intervention, and that date should be in here. It was really the decisive turn in the war came in 2015 with the arrival of Russian military assistance, namely in the form of air power in 2015, right? So, and that air cover, right, and that sort of firepower made it possible. That is what cleared the space for the Syrian regime to begin to regain territory from all of the rebel groups that had lost, with some very small exceptions. All right, so here when we're looking at, why did some regimes remain in power for Syria? Part of it was what the military did, but yeah, absolutely, it was the Russians. It was Russians with an assist from Hezbollah, the Revolutionary Guard. Those Shia militias mattered in terms of defending the regime, but it was Russian intervention that really turned the tide. And since then, the war has just wound in Syria. The government regained territory. The war has wound down and is basically over. I'm gonna talk to you all see you all for a second. The Assad regime remains in power, battered, but still standing. Turkey, again, in terms of 10 years later, Turkey maintains a zone of influence in northern Syria. This was mostly to restrain the Kurds, and Turkey still seems to be protecting a very small rebel holdout in the city of Idlib, but for the most part, the regime won. The Assad regime won, but at the expense of his own population, an extraordinary humanitarian disaster. Approximately 500,000 Syrians died in the conflict. over half of its population was displaced. It's 11 million people, over half of its population was displaced. Half of that half, so a quarter of the entire Syrian population, is internally displaced. That means they were forced from their homes, but they're still somewhere in Syria. And the other half of that half, a quarter, sought refuge abroad. And for all of the headlines about Syrians coming into Europe, the overwhelming bulk of refugees ended up in neighboring countries, namely Turkey, which is now host to about 3 million refugees, Lebanon, which has 1.5 million refugees. And it's worth pointing out, 1.5 million refugees in Lebanon, which is a small country with a small population, is equivalent to a third of its own population. So this is enormous refugee flow burden, and Jordan received 1 million refugees. So extraordinary human costs to the Syrian civil war. So so that's kind of, I don't like to be snide about this, but that's how you stay in power. You keep your military close to you, and you get Russia in on your side. So moving next, so our next category, we shouldn't make fun of it, but so Libya, Yemen, Egypt, and Tunisia they all overthrew their dictators. Both Libya and Yemen very soon after fell into civil war. And again, we're making the distinction from Syria. Syria had a civil war, but the government was a participant and successfully defended itself against rebels. So that's why it's, so Libya and Yemen both overthrew their dictators, but within a few years after doing that, they again fell into civil war. And I'm going to take these two cases together rather than, because there's some important parallels. And in this case, what happened in both cases is that you had the military splintering. So if you remember, in Syria, the military remained cohesive, right? It didn't fall apart. In both Libya and Yemen, the military splinters as you have various factions and generals and units defecting over to the rebels, over to those calling for the downfall of the regime. All right, especially in Libya, it's like the national army just disintegrated overnight as all sorts of units defected over to those calling for the downfall of the regime. Now, this military splintering helps understand what brought the regime down, right? So both Libya and Yemen, both of those dictators, if people want to look at these names again, Gaddafi and Saleh, they could not stay in power once their militaries had basically disintegrated. Okay, so it helped bring the regimes down. However, those splinters, I don't think that's the right word, those factions, those splinters of the military, then they never came back together as a united army again. They became the basis of independent militias in both of these cases, which then fought each other for territory, influence after, right, the dictator in charge had been forced to leave. Okay, so first we need to look at what the military does. And second, and I'll come to a timeline of them in just a second, I kind of want to talk about the reasons first. So you've got the military splintering as one. And the second aspect is that both Libya and Yemen are characterized by deep societal, i.e. tribal divisions, as well as long-standing territorial divisions. Okay, so what I mean by deep tribal divisions, society itself, people are, for the most part, more loyal to, more attached to, feel their identity most embedded within their tribal groups, much more so than the central government. Right? So people are attached to a specific tribe, not Libya and not Yemen. Okay, so you have these deep tribal divisions within society, as well as these long-standing regional / territorial divisions. Yemen didn't become a unified country until 1990. I actually didn't know this until I did the research for this. It was essentially these two regions, North and South, which had existed since since the British left in like early part of the 20th century, there had been a civil war between, there had been these efforts at unification, but literally there wasn't unification in Yemen until 1990. And it was in 1990, there was sort of this, there had been a long civil war, and then in 1990, there was a truce, a ceasefire, that sort of squished, melded together these two regions, but there were many ways in which these regions had never melded at all. I mean, 1990 is not that long ago. Some of us professors were old, we were alive then. So, and similarly, Libya was pasted together as a country in 1951 from these three regions, Tripoli, Fezzan, and Cyrenaica, much like Iraq was, right? So it was just these three previously autonomous units created in 1951, actually by Western powers that were concerned about communism. So put them together, put a king on top of them, ta-da, you're Libya. So, so these, and these regional divisions had never really gone away. So in both cases, these regions had never been overcome. They had simply been held together by force. They had been held together by force, often the army. And once that central force, once that central army state dissolved, literally dissolved into its constituent parts, you know, it just dissolved into its constituent parts. So one way, actually, I mean, this would be a different, wholly different lecture. Like, in a way, Arab Spring may have simply, you know, these protests may have simply just kind of allowed these countries to break into their pre-existing parts, like sort of blew apart the facade that was this country, but different sort of question. All right, so in any case, though, to the extent that Libya and Yemen, right, they existed as countries, Arab Spring comes along, and they both experienced large-scale protests. Protest begins in Yemen on January 27th, February 15th in Libya. In both cases, all protests were met with a very heavy-handed, violent government response, which in turn only stimulated more anger and more protests, which continues to read a violent response. That part should sound familiar to you by now, right? So that was pretty standard. But as I said, in both cases, the military began to splinter. And with you had large-scale defections of generals and military units declaring their support for the rebels. And here is where the stories diverge a bit. I think I can group Libya and Yemen together, but one feature that really sets Libya apart was that Libya was the beneficiary of foreign intervention on behalf of the rebels. So if you notice, when we look at both Syria and Bahrain, there was foreign intervention on behalf of the regime, right? So Saudi Arabia comes in on behalf of the Bahraini government, all sorts of, you know, Russia and all sorts of Shia militias come in on behalf of the Syrian government. What you have in Libya was basically the West, there was a UN resolution that authorized member states to establish a no-fly zone over Libya in order to prevent attacks on civilians, okay? And what this turned into was a bombing campaign by NATO forces against military installations within Libya. So if people want to talk in the question answer, like how it was that Libya got this assistance, that's a good question. For our purposes now, we're just going to take it as a given in terms of explaining outcomes. So Libya was able to obtain this protection for its rebels. And it was under that protection, there was still a war. There was still a war in which rebels fought against what did remain of the Libyan army. That Libyan war lasted until October 2011, when the last city that was loyal to Gaddafi fell to the rebels, and Gaddafi was killed by an angry mob. He was literally beaten to death in the streets by some very angry people. In Yemen, there was no foreign intervention at this point. Once Yemen falls into civil war, we're going to see significant foreign intervention. But in terms of removing Saleh from power, that was done by Yemenis themselves. Right? There was no foreign intervention in terms of overthrowing Saleh. What you had with Saleh was the power. I'll just go back to the PowerPoint so people can see. There isn't a whole lot here, but what you had in Yemen, it was purely the large scale of the protesters, as well as the declaration by the heads of powerful tribal federations. Here's the tribal part coming into play in Yemen, declaring their support for the rebels. So all sorts of elements of what had kept Saleh in power, both tribes as well as factions of the military, go over to the rebels. Okay, so that's where these two stories diverge a bit, but then we're going to bring them back together. Oh, sorry. I should say that Saleh was compelled to resign in February 2012. So Yemenis, so whereas Libyans got a chance to basically execute their leader in the streets in October 2011, in Yemen, those protesters were able to successfully compel their dictator, here we go, we'll go at Saleh, and people are forgetting names. So Yemen, Saleh, he was compelled to step down by February of 2012. So now I'm going to bring them back. Now they converge. I had to get both presidents out of the picture. Okay, so we've got both presidents out of the picture, and now their timelines converge again, because once the dictator, right, that dictator has been overthrown, each country set into motion a process, an attempt to transition to democracy. And we're going to see this both as well in Tunisia and Egypt. Once you get rid of the guy, or you get tried, then the effort is to transition to a new regime. And in both Yemen and Libya, there was this effort. If you notice, so in Libya, so at the very attempted a transition. So Libya held elections in October 2012. Yemen held new elections literally as soon as Saleh left. So you have these elections. However, in each case, this transition process in each case was stillborn in a sense, because very soon those militias that I mentioned to you created a growing chaos in each country, and neither country was able to control these militias. Because remember, in this case, the central government has more or less dissolved, right? Unlike in Syria, where the regime, the government remains intact and is a fighting force. In both of these cases, the regime sort of dissolves in a sense. And again, it's these militias that begin to take over parts of the process and also begin to take over parts of the different countries. And the transition effort formally ended in Libya in 2014, right? In winter 2014, when militias took over different parts of the country, and in Yemen in September 2014, when Houthi rebels took over the capital city. So I actually have some other images. So let's look at Yemen. I mean, if we're going to look at, let's say, Yemen. Okay. So here, so again, what I'm arguing here, that both Libya and Yemen, they were able to overthrow their dictators because the military splintered. But then what plunged them into civil war and ended up with both of them being territorially divided was also that split in militias that then had territorial home bases. And here you can see what, different militias control what. If we had more time, or if students are bored, you can look up North and South Lebanon, right? That comment that Yemen was essentially these two regions, North and South Yemen, sort of smushed together in 1990 as a country. That's basically what it looks like. So there's a way in which this Arab Spring just, put them back the way they were. And I also just want to show you Libya. So here's Libya. And in Libya, you now have actually two different governments, two different governments with two separate elected parliaments, each backed by different militias controlling the east and west of the country. So if you look here, over on the left in Tripoli is the internationally recognized executive. It's like the executive branch of Libya. Support of Mizradan militias. This is what's recognized by the United States. Over in the west, in Tobruk, if you can look over in the west, Tobruk, House of Representatives, the international recognized legislature. So you actually, if people want to talk about that, you had a set of elections, some rebel group didn't recognize them, so they held another set. And so now you actually have these two kind of competing governments backed by different militias that control different territories or different parts of what used to be Lebanon. What used to be Libya. Keep putting Libya and Yemen together. All right. Okay. Again, in terms of other outcomes, so the Yemen story. So once things collapse and divide, you've also had a continuing civil war in Yemen with extraordinary loss of life. You've got close to 250,000 deaths, cholera outbreaks, 3 million people internally displaced. So sounds a little bit like Syria, but more so than Syria, you've got 3/4 of the Yemeni population requiring food assistance, to meet basic food needs. And over 15 million people, and these I've seen 11 million in other places. So it's 11 to 15 million people in danger of starvation. I mean, so it's extraordinary humanitarian crisis that has been set in sort of continues. And this is also now you have a civil war with foreign intervention, where you've got Saudi Arabia backing we're back in Yemen now, not in Libya, backing the government that was forced to leave. So I think we've kind of wandered off, but now you have extensive Saudi bombing in order to return Yemen back to the elected government. Okay, how are we doing? We have a little bit of time. I think we're doing okay. All right, so you've got the military splintering and deep divisions in society. So moving along, now we've got to the countries that have overthrown their dictators and avoided civil war. Okay, so we're down to Tunisia and Egypt. So it's sort of 2 more contestants. So what accounts for this? And in a way, I kind of want to be sort of summarizing or bringing us along to where we are. So they were able to overthrow their dictators, avoid civil war. First, to point out, unlike a number of these cases, there was no foreign intervention in either of these cases. So foreign intervention was not present. So it neither helped Tunisia become a democracy, and it neither caused Egypt to fall back into military dictatorship. Foreign intervention was not a factor here. What is important here is that the military remained cohesive and it sided with the protesters. Okay, and so this difference differentiates it both from Syria, where the military remained cohesive but sided with the regime, as well as differentiating it from both Libya and Yemen, where the military just splintered. So in both Tunisia and Egypt, the military remained united, cohesive, and however, once the protests broke out, the military sided with the protesters. And finally, unlike Libya and Yemen, you do not have deep tribal or regional divisions. I mean, they're predominantly Sunni Muslim countries. They actually have a long history of being some sort of territorial political unit on their own. They were not sort of, again, countries that were arbitrarily cobbled together in the 20th century. Okay, so when we want to try to understand, now that we're down to Tunisia and Egypt, why Egypt fell back into military rule and Tunisia was able to transition to democracy, now we need to look at domestic factors, the actions of the important political actors, namely, again, the military, as well as the main Islamist party, okay? Now, quick definition here, an Islamist party, and generally an Islamist person and an Islamist party is one that wants to put Islam at the center of politics. So like their primary political goal, if they're to win, is that Islam and religious precepts should govern legislation, okay? And this is in contrast to, this is the political science term of secular. right? So the secularism, when political scientists talk about secularism, it's not so much that people aren't religious. People can be privately religious, but in the political science understanding of secularism and how I'm using it here, a secular political person is one that wants to keep a division between religion and politics, and that religion remains in the private sphere, right? And is not something that governs legislation and law. And what you will see in both Egypt and Tunisia, in addition to the actions of the military, but you will see intense competition between Islamists and secularists, right? Between the Islamic political party and secularists, i.e., those who do not want Islam at the center of political life. Okay, so now let's look at a little timeline. So first, we need to look at the military. Okay, so now we're down to the military, and this is the military. What did they do during the protests? So Tunisia and Egypt, just like all of the cases we've looked at, also had large protests begin, and now we're actually beginning at the beginning because we're finally at Tunisia, right, where it all started. So in Tunisia, once the protests started in December of 2010, Ben Ali, if you remember that very first slide, right? I don't know, do people need to see these names again? So now we're talking about Hosni Mubarak and Ben Ali, all right? So just pay attention to them. So in Tunisia, once the protests started, Ben Ali called upon the military to fire on protesters, to put those protests down. And the top general refused. So the top general of the Tunisian military refused to use his army to put down civilian peaceful protests. He replied that his job was to defend the country, not to defend the family of the president, because by this point, the Tunisian regime had become pretty much the Ben Ali's family and a few of his friends. So the top general said, no, I'm not going to call out my troops to defend you. He also let Ben Ali know that while the troops would not protect him from the protesters, they would assure him safe passage out of the country if he left immediately. Ben Ali took the deal. He left immediately and flew off to Saudi Arabia. And by January 14th, 2011, this is about a month later, he was gone after the start of the protests. He left. And then the Tunisian army went home. They went back to their barracks, and we don't hear from them ever again in this story. And this is what matters. But notice what you have here, and I think I didn't put it really here, do the action. So the Tunisian military, before they returned to the barracks, they sided with the protesters. That should be in the PowerPoint. Sorry, people. Right, so what does the military do? It stays cohesive and it sided with the protesters, not with the regime. Okay, sorry, that should have been in the in the PowerPoint. And there you have a similarity with Egypt. So in Egypt, protests broke out, and Egypt was very much inspired by Tunisia. Like as soon as Tunisia got things started, if you notice, they're all of the, you don't have to remember all these dates, but everything sort of falls in dominoes after Ben Ali is forced out of Tunisia. So in Egypt, protests started on January 25th. Similarly, the military was called out by Hosni Mubarak to quell these protests, to put them down with force. But given the size of the protests, I mean, the military obeyed the order to come out, came out with its tanks. But given the size of the protests, very soon the military, and it was this very dramatic moment in the Egyptian protests where the tanks were in the streets, and their guns, right, the guns on the tanks are pointed at the protesters. And then there was this very dramatic moment where they moved their guns and pointed them at the presidential palace. So it was both a sort of symbolic and it was basically saying, we're not firing on the protests. We have sided with the protesters. So it was in that moment that the military sided with the protesters, told Mubarak that his time was up. And the chant in the streets in Egypt were the people and the army are one hand. The people and the army are one hand. So the army was seen as defending the revolution. Right? And they did, they sided with the protesters. Mubarak was compelled to step down on February 11th. Again, he lasted 18 days. He was forced to step down. Okay, in contrast to Tunisia, the military never went back to its barracks. They never went home. The military continued to be a significant actor. It was the military that was overseeing the transition, and in doing so made every effort to retain its power. And in doing so, again, in cooperation with the Islamists, we'll see them again. It wasn't just the military alone, but the military remaining involved in power left them positioned in a year or so to stage a military coup in which they returned to power. Okay. So that is that in terms of the military, they remained cohesive, but they sided with the protesters. However, so in doing so, they contributed to the overthrow of Ben Ali and Mubarak. So they've overthrown their own dictators. And similar to Libya and Yemen, this sets into motion a transition to democracy via elections and the writing of a constitution. Okay. And it's during this transition period, right? Again, what you have is a dictatorship. And the first order of business is to create a framework for a democratic constitutional form of government, right? And that is the challenge of how, once you've gotten rid of that guy, I mean, first of all, what do you do with the rest of all the other guys who supported him? That's one question. But how do you create a framework for this new form of government? And it's during that period, this transition, that the actions of the main Islamist party become really important. Excuse me. And here's the short version. I mean, in my classes, we spend at least a couple weeks talking about these cases together, so it feels particularly compressed. The short version is that the main Islamist party in Tunisia, called Ennahda, acted in all sorts of compromising, moderate ways. They participated in politics. They ran in elections and they did very well. But the Ennahda in Tunisia, they basically would step, whenever conflict developed, and intense conflict did develop between Islamists and secularists in Tunisia, very intense. It looked like it was gonna all fall apart at some point in the process. And they managed to, so people in my poli-sci 108, that's just what we talked about on Monday, right? They managed to pull it together. But part of that is that the Ennahda party recognized secular concerns. They were able to compromise at key moments in this transition, and basically stepped back. Basically stepped back when it looked like the entire project of transitioning to democracy was going to fall apart. In contrast, the Muslim Brotherhood did no such thing. The Muslim Brotherhood, which also did very well in elections, it won almost a majority in the parliament and won the presidency, but it governed without any concerns whatsoever for secular concerns. So if you see my line here, not compromising, President Morsi, that was the Muslim Brotherhood president who was elected in sort of mid-2012. By November of 2012, this is in the process of trying to write a constitution. President Morsi literally declared himself above the law. He sort of said, I can take any action I need in order to pass the constitution. This set into motion massive protests by other Egyptians, predominantly secular ones who were not interested in living under that constitution that was written only by Islamists. And that, again, I'm sort of condensing here, sort of that confrontation within society ultimately led the military to step in July of 2013. And Egypt's experiment with democracy ends there. Well, ends for now. Who knows, who knows, 10, 20 years, we'll see what happens. But the military steps in, takes over in July 2013. They held elections in 2014, and I think it's particularly notable. Al-Sisi, who is now president of Egypt, he won with 96.9% of the vote. I'm looking at Professor Bose. She happened to be in my ribbon. There's no way that any president ever wins without but he was really popular. You can see how much they loved him in Egypt. And since Sisi has taken power, his government has passed all sorts of laws that crack down on civil society, eliminated political parties, deterred local dissent. So the current government has rolled back every single gain that was made in 2011 and pushed Egypt even further into autocracy. Everything that I have read and heard, either in news or in it, is that things are worse now than they were under Mubarak when he was overthrown, in terms of the constriction of political space. So things got worse in Egypt, but the winner is Tunisia. So we're going to look at Tunisia. Even though I did point out it was a real struggle, Tunisia was eventually able to get a constitution written, one that had the agreement of secular and Islamist forces, and that was not easy. That almost fell apart and needed, it wasn't external intervention, but needed some help from different aspects of society. The constitution was passed in a referendum. They held their first parliamentary elections, and since then they've had several rounds of elections. So in political science terms, we call that a consolidated democracy. That means they have had several rounds of elections. And in addition, even though there's significant discontent within Tunisia today, there are no significant political actors, no large significant political actors who believe that a return to authoritarianism is preferable. So even if, right, so when we talk about consolidated, it's both having multiple elections, but it's also about having everyone agree, or not having any large groups of people think like, you know, a military dictatorship would really be preferable to what we have now. And you don't have that in Tunisia, even as dissatisfied as many people are. So in order to become Tunisia, right, you need to have all those factors. And we're also really glossing over a fair number of what was going on in Tunisia in terms of their, because it still wasn't easy for Tunisia to get to where it ended up. So I have a few closing comments before my voice totally gives out. Excuse me. So here are my closing thoughts. Maybe you can just read them. I think we're kind of learning this in our own country too. You know, democracy is hard, or it can be hard. Like it's, you know, it's not always easy. But again, in terms of transitions to democracy, because part of what we're looking here is, you know, one is, you know, how do you get to overthrow your dictator? But part of it is also about democratic transitions. There was a study, and this is in 2017, of 91 transitions to democracy during that, you know, what is that, about a 25-year, 35-year, 74 to 2017, a third of them have reverted to authoritarian rule. Okay, so these transitions, just because you kind of move into a democracy doesn't mean you get to stay there. And another third are kind of democracies, but democracy is a name only. I mean, I didn't look closer, but local, like, you know, maybe they have elections, they're not the fairest, not all rights are protected, but that a little less than a third remain what we call a high quality liberal democracy. Okay, so democracy is hard, transitions to democracy are hard. And I hope, sort of another thing that I didn't put here, but I hope became clear in this talk, when we're talking about Arab Spring, if you notice, I never once made a reference to like culture or mentality or psychology, that this is all about institutions, foreign intervention, pre-exist, you know, sort of history, you know, in terms of regions, stuff that, you know, so that's another point, important point that I think is here. And finally, I want to make a nod to my guests for the sort of people joining us, I guess, from Professor Fritz's class on terrorism, because I think that there's sort of a subtext here. So I would like to offer Arab Spring as either a counterpart, not necessarily, or possibly a contradiction, right, to the frame of looking at the Arab world or the Muslim world primarily through the lens of terrorism. I don't know, I'm not sure if we actually do that as much as we, like, when there was Al-Qaeda. So Professor Fritz, I can actually see you. Do you cover ISIS in your class at all? I'm like making references to ISIS. Oh, you're muted. Yeah, okay, just say yes. Okay, so great. So just in terms of numbers, thanks. Sorry, you're muted by the powers that be, and then we'll conduct. So at its height, ISIS had about 30,000. It's hard to count ISIS fighters, okay? But sort of rough estimates were 30,000, with about 20,000 of them coming from abroad. So this is like, you know, from all over so 30,000. There were 300,000 Egyptians in Tahrir Square. Remember that clip I saw you at the beginning? In Tahrir Square alone. That doesn't even count all the ones in all the other countries. And I didn't have a chance to add them all up, but it's easily, you know, some other tens of thousands of protesters, right, going into the street, demanding, you know, democracy, fairness, and so on. And so I think what's important to leave you with is that given the opportunity, democracy is the preferred option. It's sort of what people would like, but for all the reasons we talked about, it can be very difficult to get there. But in terms of what people would like, I think that these protests shed a little bit of light on that. So I actually did that a little faster than I thought I would. So that's good, because then we have a good 20 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing. And I think now what I do is I turn it over to Professor Dudek to call on people for questions.
So first of all, thank you so much, Professor Nanes. We really appreciate it. It was a great encapsulation of a really significant moment of history and where we are now. So I'm going to open it up to questions. And if you would all please use the raise hand function. So if you go on Zoom, if you're on your computer, you go under reactions, and that's where the raise hand function is. And I believe it's under participants to find the raise hand function if you are on like an iPad or something like that. So Layla Abelman, if you could, it's nice to see you, by the way. Nice to see you, Layla.
Hi, Layla.
Hi. So I do have a question. I'm coming from Professor Fritz's class. I do appreciate that you made that mention about how, you know, the Middle East isn't only terrorism. I think that's definitely important to talk about when talking about these topics. But I am wondering, how did the Arab Spring and subsequent civil wars impact the rise of ISIS?
Oh, okay. I need to write that down. Okay. Arab Spring. Okay. I probably should, Layla, you just
take them one at a time, I think. Go ahead and answer that one, Professor.
Okay, we'll do them one at a time. Okay. Yeah, so if I'd had more time, right, that would have been another impact that we should have, so I'm glad you asked. So how did it impact the rise of ISIS? I'd say two ways. I guess this is off the cuff. The most significant way, or sort of way in which you know, Arab Spring contributed to the rise of ISIS was once Syria fell into a civil war, there was a power vacuum, and Syria was very much a place where all sorts of rebel groups, including you know, the seeds of ISIS came. So the seed of ISIS is actually Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Okay, so Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which got its start after the US invades Iraq in 2003. You have a collapse of authority in Iraq. Al-Qaeda comes in, you've got Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was actually more or less marginalized, defeated, not a real threat by 2010. But what you had intervening, I guess, in terms of the rise of ISIS, I don't know what Professor Fritz is talking about, but here's where I think ISIS comes from. So you've got the seed with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then you have in 2003, and then you have 7 or so years of a Shia prime minister whose name was Nouri al-Maliki, who isolated and sidelined Sunni Iraqis, particularly ones who wanted to be in the militia. So you've basically got sort of, repression is a strong word, but certainly marginalization, yeah, you could, yeah, maybe repression. I mean, they were Iraqi citizens. These were Sunni Iraqis, who were Iraqi citizens, but were more or less excluded in important ways from sort of positions of power. They were excluded from the police force. So the point being, Layla, is that you had significant Sunni Iraqi discontent in Iraq, but predominantly as a result of the Iraqi government, like this Shia politician or Shia party or whatever. Now that discontent is sort of growing. And then when you have Syria become sort of a vacuum of power, that it moves and it sort of metastasizes and then comes back into Iraq and takes over parts of Iraq. So the Arab Spring, kind of allowed this opportunity for what used to be Al-Qaeda in Iraq, add Nouri al-Maliki's suppression and marginalization of Sunnis, and then there's a place where they can go kind of regroup in Syria to then come back over the border and take over parts of Iraq. How does that work? Yeah. Arab Spring also,
that makes sense.
I'm actually going to use you. Arab Spring also had an impact in Arab countries that I didn't even get to talk about. Iraq and Lebanon, as well as Morocco and Jordan. There's one more and I can't think of it. Places where you had massive protests, right? So you had massive protests, but they weren't calling for the overthrow of the regime. So in Morocco and Jordan, they're both monarchies. So it's kind of like Bahrain, but these are monarchies that are reasonably well respected, reasonably well liked, not widely hated. Okay, so their legitimacy is more or less respected. And what people in Morocco and Jordan wanted was less corruption, more some political reforms. And that was the same in Iraq. You actually had some significant Arab Spring protests. This is aside from ISIS, but significant protests within Iraq that were inspired by Arab Spring, but they were about reform and end to corruption. They weren't calling for the overthrow of the regime. So a previous iteration of this talk, when I thought I had more time, made that distinction that these protests we reached a wider range of countries, but in a significant number of these countries, this was an opportunity to call for reform, not for overthrow. And so the countries that I focused on, again, in the interest of time, were the ones where they were calling for overthrow. And that was very much, if you had an authoritarian dictatorship, like the ones I described, pretty heavy-handed dictatorship, then you had a call for overthrow. If you had a supposed democracy, we're talking about Lebanon and Iraq, which are very dysfunctional. I mean, democracy, hybrid, dysfunctional in significant ways that degrade the quality of their democracy, very significant ways. However, it was enough that people weren't calling for the overthrow of the system for something else. So you asked about in terms of ISIS, it had to dip. Now I'm actually telling you about the impact in Iraq. Just like I do in your regular classes, I use an opportunity to make a different point. But it did. I mean, that's in terms of Arab Spring impacting ISIS. It provided the opportunity in Syria for Al-Qaeda in Iraq to sort of reformulate itself and then become the force that it was. Professor Dudek.
Thomas Nielsen?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what were some of the main sources of division among Syrian rebel factions? Because it sounds like there were certain divisions that kept them from unifying against the Syrian government.
Okay. All right, so the question was about, what were those divisions among Syrian rebels? The biggest one was the secular Islamist. Again, the majority, so again, we'll start with the smaller ones. A very small number of Syrian rebels were those nice, like the ones calling for parliamentary democracy, the ones that we would like to see win. They were there, but they were, by all accounts, were very much the minority. The majority of the rebel groups, had some sort of Islamist tinge or flavor. I did read in places that this didn't make a whole lot of sense because Syria itself was in fact a pretty secular society. I've seen writings that only for some of those groups was Islam in fact part of their true ideology. But what that meant is that other rebel groups, in order to capture some of those fighters, kind of would throw in a little bit of Islam into what they said they were fighting for. So there's that. The biggest, the largest rebel group was called the Nusra Front, right? Which was an offshoot, if I remember, this is a while ago, but which was an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. So again, we've got Al-Qaeda coming to, you talk about Al-Qaeda, right, Professor Fritz? Yeah, okay, so you've got Al-Qaeda coming to all these places, and then they sort of morph in their, you know, locality. So you have Al-Qaeda coming to Syria, and they rename themselves the Nusra Front. And then back to Layla's point, it's actually a fight between some people in the Nusra Front that someone breaks off to start pointing ISIS. I mean, it was kind of messy. So the biggest one is Islamist secular. And again, even within those categories, particularly within the Islamist categories, there were multiple ones, the Nusra Front, and then you've got the ISIS-backed ones. And you also had a lot of militias that had no real ideology whatsoever. You know, there was a lot of evidence that it just didn't take a lot of money or resources, that you had a lot of Gulf donors sending a couple $1,000s, which would be enough to pay a rebel group to take over a little territory, fight a little bit, and send back some videos. So yeah, I know we can talk about that. But the main rebel groups were in fact Islamists, like Sunni Islamists. The biggest one was the Nusra Front, which I think was ideologically committed to Sharia law. And again, as a side, I think this was always the reason the U.S. gets a bad rap for not intervening more. And if you notice, the United States did not intervene in Syria. And there's a lot of criticism of the U.S. for, you know, not tilting the scale, especially once Russia intervened on behalf of the regime. But the rebels and the rebel groups, it was such a, there was no unified command, right? And I've always sort of felt some sympathy for the argument that if the U.S. had sent any arms or any support, it could have easily been taken over by Al-Qaeda-backed, you know, militias. Like it was just kind of chaos. There was no way to know who was fighting for what. It was kind of a long, winding answer, but does that answer your?
Yes, thank you.
Enough? Okay.
Rowan?
Sure. So my question is, in terms of the Arab Springs, was there any, like, I guess, hard support from big actors like China, Russia, or the United States in terms of funding of money, food or supplies or arms to any of these rebellions?
Okay, so your question is money or arms from China, specifically China, US, and Russia, or other?
Yeah, or even like any European countries. Like, was there any like blatant hard support for the rebellion in any of these countries involved in the Arab Springs from any of these big actors?
Okay, so you're talking about specifically, is there support to the protesters, to the rebels calling for?
Yeah, I guess more is like, is it like truly grassroots, or is it being funded from other geopolitical warfare?
Oh, I mean, the protests, okay, I think I understand. Okay, so there's part of your question that I at least reference to in the talk, but in terms of the grassroots protesters, no, that came from them. There was no, I mean, those protests in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya, those were entirely homegrown domestic affairs, 100%. There were no civil, there was nothing support. I mean, if anything, the US is funneling millions, is it billions of dollars to the Egyptian government? I should know, right? You know, so in terms of the grassroots, but then, you know, eventually you do have the UN passing a resolution to protect Libyan civilians and Libyan rebels. I mean, I think that constitutes help. You've got Russia, you know, coming in and, you know, acting on behalf of the Syrian, the Assad regime against the rebels. Which again, back to Thomas's point, which, you know, for all their disorganization, they were able to take over some some significant territory. China was not a significant, I mean, yeah, I mean, the primary actors in all of these, I mean, Russia only intervened in any significant way in Syria. The whole NATO, UN, that was only happened in the case of Libya. Otherwise, it's entirely regional actors. predominantly Saudi Arabia in the case of both Yemen and Syria, and certainly Iran and other Shia militias in the case of Syria. The Houthi rebels in Yemen are sort of widely talked about as being backed by Iran, but I've also read things that they're not really under the control of Iran. So the civil war in Yemen, as it stands today, is often framed as another proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but and is clearly Saudi Arabia doing the bombing campaign. But I've seen sort of conflicting accounts of whether or not Iran is backing the Houthis. Is that answering your question, Ron? Yeah, that's.
Yeah, I would say so. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise a lot. I mean, everything that happened in Egypt was sort of domestically grown. I mean, weirdly enough, I think Saudi Arabia and maybe Qatar. No, Qatar was. There's some element of some funding, like from Saudi Arabia to Sisi, but that's after Morsi had been overthrown. I think that there are some elements of some money flows going, but the ones that were decisive and sort of significant in terms of outcomes are the ones that I've described to you.
Thank you. Layla?
Yeah, forgive me if you mentioned this and I just missed it, but why did Russia get involved in Syria?
Basically, Syria is Russia's kind of only real friend in the region. Like, I mean, I'm kind of looking to Professor Fritz, but yeah, it's like, I mean, I think some Americans might find this hard to believe, but most of the countries in the region are either closely allied with the United States or really not. I mean, with the exception of Iran, right? So they're like, well, put aside Iran, because we're talking about the Arab world. Iran is not part of Arab Spring. It's not Arab. But in terms of the Arab world, Layla, most Arab countries are either our close ally, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, or like basically our friend. I mean, Iraq is not our best friend, but we're not in an active state. So Syria is really the only outlet for Russian influence in the region. And I think that once Russia saw the Syrian regime really sort of tottering and not clear if it was going to be able to hold on, Russia wanted to intervene. I remember also reading something that sort of, this was also something about his real distaste for chaos, like or his preference for stability, that grew out of his own experience. I'm not a psychologist kind of person, but you know, I don't think psychology helps much, but that, you know, whether or not Putin actually thought that these sort of like people power demonstrations were going to somehow spread to Russia. You know, Putin, you know, still is kind of sad that the Soviet Union doesn't exist, right? And so, you know, I've read some things that like he just sort of doesn't like this whole rebelling to overthrow your government kind of thing. But I think the best answer is mostly the strategic ally one, which is that Syria was really the only country in which Russia could sort of have the upper hand, be the predominant ally. And they didn't want the Syrian regime to fall.
Sahir?
Sahar?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of piggyback off of Layla's question about why the UN, I guess, and specifically NATO intervened in Libya, because I would say there has been more devastation probably in Yemen and Syria where civilian protection was needed. So why specifically did they decide Libya was where they're going to offer their protection?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, when the Libyan rebels got that protection, it was very early on. And you didn't have the Yemeni civil war yet. You didn't even have the Syrian civil war necessarily yet, because that, I mean, what was it, like middle of March, you know, mid to late March in 2011. So at the time that, you know, Libya got that help, you didn't have the situations yet in Syria and Yemen. So it wasn't like they chose, right, which was a worse situation. Part of what happened, and this is where like being able to sort of delve into each case in a little more detail gives us an opportunity. Part of what happened in the Libyan case is that as soon as those protests broke out, almost immediately, you had Libyans, some inside the country and some outside the country. And in fact, there was one who was like a Libyan American, he was like a professor at some American university, where they quickly sort of banded together to form a government in exile. So they put themselves together. What was it? It was the NTC, National Transition. Libya, there's like a ton of acronyms when you look at Libya, but basically you had this group of Libyans both inside and outside of the country. They banded themselves together and they declared the Gaddafi regime illegitimate, right? Illegitimate, and that they themselves were the legitimate speakers on behalf of the Libyan people. And in doing so, it was kind of this unified sort of address, and they went to the UN to advocate for protection for Libyan civilians, because at the time, Gaddafi was claiming, right, or his regime was claiming that he was going to flatten cities, was really going to, commit atrocities. So the justification that was brought to the UN was that the Gaddafi regime is a murderous regime. He'll stop at nothing, short of eliminating his entire whole population, and that they required international support. Okay. Now, what's interesting, and I might see now we're into IR, which is what is interesting is that the United States, both Hillary Clinton and I remember John McCain, really spearheaded this effort. Like, so you did have this Libyan effort, but it was absolutely, I mean, as far as I remember, it was the United States really leading this effort in the UN to gain this resolution, specifically in this case, because you are right, like none of the other rebel groups got it. I'm not sure if that none of the other rebel groups were asked for it. Like maybe they weren't, because what you had in the Libyan case was this coordination and this body of people that presented themselves and asked for help, and asked for protection. I mean, that's basically, what I know. I've also heard some stuff like, there's actually oil in Libya, a fair amount of it. I mean, so I don't know, Professor Fritz, can you be unmuted? Is there anything you want to add to this? I'm happy to share the stage with you. What else do we know about why Libya got help?
So but add just maybe a handful of things. I think the domestic politics inside Libya that you talked about are critically important, and sort of what was passed at the UN was based upon the responsibility to protect the R2P, because Gaddafi did promise to make the streets of Benghazi run red with blood, right? I mean, he publicly said this.
Right.
Russia and China reluctantly went along with that resolution in this concept of R2P. And then they claim the understanding this was only to protect the civilians. And when they saw that the NATO bombing was used to help overthrow the Gaddafi regime, what we've seen is Russia and China oppose any UN Security Council resolution to do anything in Syria in particular, given Russia's interest there, but also China's interest in not having this concept of R2P spread. And Russia blocking Syria for the longstanding interest there too. So, I mean, you have, and this with Yemen, the US has played that a little bit soft because of the alliance with Saudi Arabia. So it hasn't pushed very hard to do much at the UN Security Council in terms of something on the scale of Libya. There have been other actions, of course. So, from the international, from the UN and IR perspective, I think that's the main stuff I would add.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. We are exactly at 4:05, which is when your class ends. So we are right on time. I really want to thank all of you for coming. And I particularly want to thank Professor Nanes for providing such an insightful coverage of a lot of information. So that was really amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. And also thank you, Professor Fritz, for your insights as well. Appreciate it. Have a great afternoon, everyone.